All right, we're going to be playing a little history today. So those of you that like history will be interested. And even if you aren't, the story behind the history in this case is really compelling. So our scripture is Revelation 21. That's the new heaven and the new earth. That's when Jesus returns, brings the keys with him, and says, ladies and gentlemen, it's closing time. We are moving out of the old creation that is corrupted, and we're moving into the new creation. Revelation 21 explains the city. He says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. So he's talking about earth here. This is not someplace way up somewhere else. This is bringing earth back to the state that it was in with Eden. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people. Well, where was God's dwelling place in the Old Testament? It was in the temple. And now they're saying there is no temple, no need for a temple, because God is going to dwell with us directly. He says it's among the people. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order has passed away. He who is seated on the throne says, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. It's done. It's over. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. So, what do we have to look forward to? A new heaven and a new earth. That's not where we're at right now by any means, but it is where all things are new. In Exodus, God walked with Israel. In Revelation, God comes down to earth and actually dwells in the whole New Jerusalem. Now, I think the language is figurative. It says that the New Jerusalem is going to be about 1,500 miles out from the center. That was roughly the size of the Roman Empire. Take that. It's they kind of tweaked their thumb at it, right? They tweaked their nose and said, Rome thinks they're big. This kingdom is going to be everything. And then it says that the buildings are 1,500 miles high. I kind of think that is probably figurative language. Although I would really like to see a 1,500-mile high building. That would be swift. But the point being is this thing is going to be, this New Jerusalem is majestic. And it holds in it, other than the old Eden, if you will, the first Eden was a garden. This Eden is a city. It has a garden, it has country, it has city, it has everything. And I think the reason that it's doing that is it's kind of saying, that sounds like the world, doesn't it? Some places are rural, some places are urban, and I think it's saying all of that is what you're going to find in the New Jerusalem, because what we hear in the Old Testament that goes on over and over again is that the world is filled with God's glory. And so it's a city with a combinations of garden and country. It seems to represent the world. Habakkuk says, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Numbers says, as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. Isaiah says they were calling to one another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. But this is a big but here now. In the midst of all that conversation about the new heavens and the new earths, we get this in verse 7. Those who are victorious will inherit all of this. I will be their God, they will be my children. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, in other words, the ones who just never got it right, they never accepted Christ, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. That's the second death. So the point being here is that this ultimate victory where God truly has the whole world in his hands is in the middle of that. We're still warned that there are people that just don't want to be in God's hands. And it won't, and this ultimate victory of the new heaven and the new earth won't be without a struggle. Now that's the reality. And we haven't seen that new heaven, new earth yet. It hasn't come to fruition. So now's where we start the history. Because even though we haven't reached that new heaven, new earth, we've had glimpses of what this new reality will look like in our own worlds from time to time. And ironically, a lot of times these glimpses show up in the most horrific of conditions. If you would have been in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, there would have been this big battleship that came sailing into the harbor with a huge fleet with it. That also had this huge armada of planes that came over in a military show of force, because this was the time where Japan was about to have unconditional surrender. It was the declaration of the formal end to World War II. Well, the war was vicious. The cost was enormous. How enormous? About 85 million people died in World War II. 85 million. Let's put that in perspective. COVID killed about 7 million worldwide. In a world, a population that was far greater than what it was in 1945. 85 million. You want to know the rest of the sad story? 50 million of those were probably civilian. So when we say that war is fought amongst combatants, they're not. They're not. That's the horror story. That's up at 50,000 feet. But when you get into the details of this very horrific war, some of the things you find out are absolutely incredible. In fact, the only answer that you have when you hear the story is, well, that was God. So, trivia, who was Mitsuo Fuchida? He was the man who led the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was the guy who sent the message back to his fleet that said, Torah, 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 tiger, 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 which meant what? Complete surprise. We have the enemy exactly where we want them. 3 battleships, 2,400 men later. This all took place in what? A couple hours? Not long at all. And America is basically wiped out for most of its Pacific fleet. The carriers weren't there. So if you study the life of this guy, Mitsuo Fuchida, it gets really interesting. He was the hero. He would have been the Japanese John Wayne, if you will. As the war went on, he went to a little island called Midway, where America brought him back to Japan. He was almost killed by a bomb blast. He was not able to fly that day, but he was on the deck. And the bomb blast almost took him out. He went all through the war, planning, plotting, attacks, counterattacks. He saw the war slipping away from Japan. Interestingly, while the war was slipping away, he details this. He says that some of the stories that were coming back from some of the leaders were just completely false. They were telling the people in Japan that, oh, we won in the Coral Sea. We annihilated 9 aircraft carriers, when the Coral Sea was anything but a Japanese victory. So in other words, people were just being lied to. As the time went on, he discovered that this was not only intentional, but it was widespread. And then there was the bomb. After the bomb, he was called to go to Hiroshima, and he was to go find out what happened. And he describes where people literally had skin falling off of their face. He stayed there for a fairly long time, but yet he never wound up with radiation poisoning. He for whatever reason, he didn't have that problem. So as this was going on and he saw his leaders lying to his own country, he started to become disenchanted a little bit with the war, not just a little bit, but a lot. And so as the war finally ended, he watched MacArthur give the speech, and And he knew that if this would have been if Japan would have won the war, that this would not have been a very gracious kind of a overture. But yet MacArthur was reaching out to the Japanese people, and he was even sneaking in scripture. We're going to talk about that a little bit next week as he was dealing with them. Just you ain't got to worry about that, little baby. That's just the sound of happiness. Don't you even. So after the war, there were war trials for some of the Japanese. Fuchida would get called to testify at some of these trials. When he did, he became more and more angry because he thought that America would have done the same thing that these people were describing in these Japanese war trials. In one particular war trial, there was a very horrific story about the Philippines. There was a hideaway after Japan invaded the Philippines. Everybody bugged out to the mountains. They went to places where they could hide. Well, a group of missionaries and a few other people started a place called Hopeville. It was way off the beaten path. They all had places where they could hide, all this other kind of stuff if the Japanese ever showed up. They lived there in peace for probably a year or so. One day, out of the woods comes a Japanese soldier. These were missionaries who had been in Japan, so he could speak to the soldier in fluent Japanese. The soldier was shocked to hear that, and he told him, he said, "I found nothing here," and disappeared back into the woods. But what ultimately happened was they captured one of the guerrillas, the guerrilla fighters that were bringing the resistance from the Filipinos and back to the Japanese. And he spilled the beans on where their location was. This all comes out in the testimony. They were actually holding church that day. They had built an open-air church, and they had a little altar that they had built. And they had an organ that one of the ladies had brought with her from Japan over to Singapore, and now out into the jungle. Because these had originally all been Japanese missionaries. When the Japanese showed up, it was clear that their fate was sealed. Although a couple of them could speak perfect Japanese, they couldn't reason with the guy. And he was like, "You're prisoners, you're spies, you're going to be executed." And so they asked, "Well, give us 30 minutes. And they did. So the little group in Hopeville had their 30 minutes of prayer. And one of the things, and Fuchida's hearing this at the details. When that was over with, they took the children, brought them into a hut where they bayoneted them. They then decapitated the rest of the adults. And they took all the bodies, the decapitated, so forth and so on, put them in a hut and burned them. So Fuchida hears this. He's in no way, this is obviously something that he's not necessarily endorsing, but he's also convinced that the Americans are doing things just as bad. So after the war ended, he goes to Tokyo, where troops were getting off of the boats, coming back from being prisoners of war in America. And he sees one of the guys who had actually served with him at Midway. He thought he had been killed. And the guy said, "Well, I was so ashamed that I had been captured that I just changed my name." He said, "Well, they buried you in your hometown." And then when I did that, I could think of that Andy Griffith show where the guy decided that he couldn't go back and see his wife, so he wound up dead. And it's kind of, I'm like, there's a little sick humor in all of this. But Fuchida sits down with this guy, and he says, "How did they treat you?" And he thinks, what does he think he's about to hear? Torture. "You were miserably treated," right? And he says, "Really not too bad." He said, "They were rough on us, but we got good meals. They took care of us medically." And he said, "And there was this lady there. And she was so nice to us. And she spoke fluent Japanese." Fuchida's listening to this. And as they're telling the story, flashing back to the Hopeville, the guy said one of the last things that the group did was offer a prayer, and it burned Fuchida. He was like, "What were they saying?" And so he's talking to his friend, and his friend keeps talking to him about this person that was so nice. And he said, why? And I think you can see where this is going. She had been in Japan, and she said, well, my parents were Japanese missionaries, and they've been killed in the war. So Fujita, at this point, is now trying to process this. His just tore up. He's where we all are sometimes when we get conflicted about where is this God guy and do I really take him serious? And this is kind of where he was. In the meantime, after he talked to his friend, he goes back into Tokyo and Fujita's trying to find a Bible. Now he went to a couple of bookstores and they said, we don't have them. But then when he's walking out, he sees this Japanese guy street preaching on the side of the road. And he had a Bible. And it cost him a couple of yen to get it. So Fujita, when he sees him, he approaches the man. He says, you speak of a God we can't see. And the man said, yes, we do. And we wait patiently for him to return. So Fujita bought the Bible. The man challenged him. He said, read any 30 pages. It was the New Testament. Read any 30 pages, and you'll know it's true. Test it. See for yourself. For 6 months, Fujita kept the book, but he never opened it. He was busy. He was coming back from the war. He was trying to get a little farm started, but he never forgot about it. Eventually, he opens the New Testament, and he starts to read about the crucifixion. This is what he said. He said, this was a good man who only gave to others. But he was treated horribly by those who hated him, and he was killed for no good reason. When they came to the place called the Skull, then he started to read from the scripture itself. It says, there they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. He's reading that. When he reads that, his mind goes back to that trial when he says, I wonder what they prayed. He said at that point it hit him. The missionaries prayed the same thing that Christ prayed. Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And the reality of that power was inescapable. He could not get away from it. This is the man who was responsible for the deaths of over 2,400 people and in subsequent battles after that. Now he knew. He knew what they had prayed. And at that point, the man who led the attack on Pearl Harbor surrendered. He had wondered where the source of deep love that the girl from the hospital and the captured Doolittle raider, and we're going to talk about him next week, because the captured Doolittle raider, if you don't remember, Jimmy Doolittle flew B-25 bombers in retaliation to bomb Tokyo just to prove that America could reach out and touch them. They had to leave their ships early than they had planned because they had been spotted by a scout boat and they didn't have enough fuel to run their missions as they had intended to, which would have put them back landing in free China. So they had to ditch, and they ditched everywhere. Well, one of Doolittle's guys was caught, and he spent years in solitary confinement, and he hated the Japanese. But yet something happened in his life that we'll talk about next week. Fast forward to the end of the war, this gentleman goes back to Tokyo, the one who had been a prisoner of war, and one of his lifelong friends becomes the guard who had tortured him unceremoniously through the entire time that he was there. So this is the power that Fujita is now having to deal with, right? So as Christ said, I make all things new. Well, he did. And he started to connect the dots between that war trial And then it made sense to him because he then found out that this lady that they were talking about, that was actually her parents that were killed, that this other Japanese soldier was describing. And he kept, and then his friend who had been personally treated by this lady said she has an undying love for our country and our people. And then when they asked her why, she said, because my parents were missionary and they were killed by Japanese. What a strange story. So now I'm going to let Fuchida speak for himself. He was now part of a group of small missionaries, some Japanese, some Westerners, and they were beginning to try and hone in on the Japanese people to spread the gospel. Fuchida said, no way, that's not what I signed up for. I'm a believer and all that, but man, I'm not the guy that needs to be standing up in front of these people saying anything. But he did go with them to an, I guess you'd call it an opportunity they were having that afternoon. And one of the Western guys was standing up on the street corner trying to convince everyone that the gospel was important and so forth. And the Japanese would stop for just a second. But not long, they would keep going on. And Fuchida's watching this, and he says, I had to do something. He says, so I look out there in the crowd, and I see this one lady, and she has no hope in her face. Now, this is a country that has seen literally what no country has ever seen before, the annihilation of a city too with a single bomb. This kind of hell has never been unleashed in the history of man, but it was. And we're not discussing the necessity of that, although there was one, because the Japanese strategy was we will extract as many American lives as we can to where they will no longer propagate this to the end point. And that was, they were more than willing to give up at least 1 million of their people. So, different story there. But where we're at now is he looks out there and he sees this lady with no hope and he says, I got to say something. These are his words. My name is Mitsuo Fuchida. I served our emperor with devotion and loyalty as if he were my very father. I was proud to lead the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, if you're a Japanese and this just got said, what do you think happens? They're not just walking anymore. Now all of a sudden people are looking up. Everyone stopped. They said that it became electric. The crowd was growing. Not only growing, it was growing quickly because people were murmuring, going, check this out. That's right. I am Fuchida. I sent the message. Tora, Tora, Tora. I believed in the war. I believed that we were on a righteous path, that we were superior to other nations and races, that we had a destiny to fulfill. Well, the people hearing this now, this is almost like a Jesus thing. Whereas Jesus starts to talk, people just show up. And as Fuchida started to talk, his country people started to just show up. In fact, it got so bad that the police had to start directing traffic. But that wasn't going so well because most of the police weren't even paying attention to the traffic. They were watching him. For years, we were told over and over that we stood high above all the nations of the world. But where did that proud idea lead us? Doesn't Yamato mean great harmony? What harmony did we produce? In seeking honor for ourselves, we reaped disgrace instead. A Japanese missionary who knew Fuchida never imagined that he would be so determined, but then he realized this is the same warrior that led an attack against Pearl Harbor. He's just warring for a different cause. After the war, Fuchida continued, our emperor said he wanted to establish a peace that would last 1,000 generations. How could anyone do such a thing? Ignorance breeds misunderstanding. Misunderstanding breeds hatred, and hatred breeds fighting. Some say if we got rid of weapons, we'd get rid of war, but that is not true. The war comes from the heart. Therefore, peace must begin in the heart as well. I've seen the effects of the most powerful bomb ever created by mankind. I walked amongst the tens of thousands of dead in Hiroshima. But I've seen something much more powerful, a power that is even able to overcome hatred, the most destructive force of all. I heard about a girl whose parents were killed by Japanese soldiers, but instead of seeking revenge against them, she offered forgiveness. She traveled far and served the soldiers of Japan in a hospital in America. I could not understand why she would do this. At first, I thought she must have been crazy, that she should have taken revenge. But deep inside, I was ashamed. Ashamed because I knew she had a sincere love. As surely as the sun rises, revenge killing is wrong. And this young lady was right. She had broken the chains of hatred. I asked myself, where does this love come from? By now, the crowd was really growing. He says, and then I heard about this American prisoner who also found this secret, who was tortured by our soldiers, whose friends were executed. Yet somehow he came to love his enemies. So I decided to study the book they studied, the Bible. And as I read, I began to understand. We were mistaken about God. The respect and honor that belongs to him, we had given to a mere man. That man is like us. Even our emperor must take his proper place amongst men, and we were mistaken about ourselves. There is no favored race. Yes, stronger animals dominate weaker animals, but people are made in God's image. Those who believe they are no more than animals will live like animals, fight like animals, and ultimately die like animals. Slowly, Fuchita's talking, I began to understand how these people could live like they did. They simply gave to others the love that they had received from their Father in heaven. And they could freely forgive because they themselves had been freely forgiven through his Son. I thought about how I waged war with this hatred and revenge in my own heart. A war that led to the deaths of millions of people, millions from many nations. By this point, Fuchita was emotional. He was crying. I would give anything to take back my actions at Pearl Harbor, but this is impossible. What can I say to the God above but to ask forgiveness? We were wrong. I was wrong. I didn't know what I was doing. We hate, and we are hated in return. And then we have even more hate. But when we love, we are likely to be loved in return, which begins the cycle of love. I have participated in the cycle of hatred for much of my life, but now I want to begin the cycle of love as often as I can in as many places as I can. Our nation wasn't destroyed by the Allied powers. No, we destroyed ourselves by reaping the results of our own pride. We're all children of the same Creator God, and therefore all brothers of the same blood, all people under one roof, one family. And then he finished with this. Japan still has a great destiny to fulfill in bringing harmony to the world, but not through war. Now I finally understand there can be no brotherhood of man without the brotherhood of God. Fuchita established the Captain Fuchita Evangelical Association, and after the war he traveled full-time sharing a presentation of his conversion story. He wrote an autobiography From Pearl Harbor to Calvary in 1959, and in that he wrote, I remember the thrill that was mine when in one of my first meetings, I led my first soul to Christ in America, and he was one of my own countrymen. In 1952, he toured with the Worldwide Christian Missionary Army of Sky Pilots. One of the guys mentioned, it is the most incredible thing to look across at a person who is now your brother, who a few short years ago was your sworn enemy. And Jesus says, behold, I make all things new. We so underappreciate the power of God's love, because in our world today, we have pea in a pillow syndrome. We can't stand anything being slightly out of kilter. If it is, there's hell to pay, and somebody better line up and do it. I'm mad. I've been offended. I've been this. I've been that. And yet, in reality, none of you've had to stare yourself in the face and say, I have been part of an effort to kill people that was absolutely, unabashedly wrong. Who does Fachita sound like? Paul. He's just having the same experience that Paul had 2,000 years before, when he said, how in the world could I be out here killing these people? This is the God that I'm actually serving. And when Fachita realized that the God he was serving had nothing that he wanted to do with the destruction of people. And then we see what evil can do, because evil allows you to take a child and bring them into a hut and bayonet them. Evil allows you to decapitate someone. And the last words of the lady who was a missionary, I don't know why you're doing this. We're just missionaries. Those were her last words. Evil is what allows you to walk into a school of Amish children, line the girls up along the blackboard, tell the boys to leave, and then tell the girls, I've got to kill you because my child died. This is what evil does. And it's powerful, because when hatred gets a hold of you, it does not turn loose. The only thing that will lubricate that evil to be done with it is the love of God. And here, Fachita says, I realized that. I realized that the hatred I carried my entire life did nothing in comparison to the love of God. So, it's 2024 tomorrow.
Close enough.
Yeah. All things are new. It's a new year. It's a new opportunity to ask yourself, and for me to ask myself, because I got to tell you, this embarrasses me. This hurts to read this and to see the power that someone else is experiencing and then go, how is it so easy just to walk past that? And the reason is because we kind of live like fat cats in this country. We've got everything we want and a lot of stuff we don't need. And here was a guy who realized the thing that he needed was not fame, he had all of that. Can you imagine what it looked like that day when he just stepped up a little bit on one of the little podium that the guy was on? He said, I am Fachita. And these people would have done what? This would have been like New York and somebody standing up and going, I'm Babe Ruth. Or Chicago, I'm Michael Jordan. I mean, everybody wants to know. And this instrument of hate then became an instrument of love. What a story. So as you hit 2024, the power that made Fachita new is in work in all of us. Sometimes we just don't let it work. But man, if we do, and what's really sad is, I don't know that the average Christian has even a scintilla of an idea of what happened to the man who planned and ultimately led the attack on Pearl Harbor. church is just fumbled sometimes. I mean, that's just all it is to it. We don't honor what we should sometimes. That's information that should never be lost for many of you. There's a book right there on the table called Wounded Tiger. It provides these three lives, how they interchange, and it starts very early on, before the attack on Pearl Harbor. So you get to know these people, how they think, why they were doing what they were doing, why the girl was in Japan, why she left Japan. You hear all of these stories, and then you get to see how it all comes together at the end. If you like history, I would tell you need to buy that book. It's powerful. But in the meantime, what I would say even more so is the power that transformed Fuchitas and all others. And that should do something, that should embolden us, empower us to be able to talk with the same kind of wisdom that he did. So Happy New Year. But it's not just happy. It's a time for us to get off of our John Brown hind parts and get to work. Father, we ask that you be with us as we enter the new year, as we allow you to make us new all over again, as we strive to just simply be the new creation that you have made us to be, designed to do good works prepared in advance. They're there for us. As 2024 starts, may it start on a high note where we all, the first resolution that we probably all need to make is, use me, Lord. Just use me. And you need to be careful, because if you say that and you mean it with sincerity, it's going to get real, and it's going to get real in a hurry. So we ask that you be with us as we joyfully work our way into the new year. And we do know that the whole world is in your hands. It's in your Son's name we pray.